Hey, class. In this podcast, I want to talk about the mission Presidio system. And what that was, and the way to think about it is this was the Spanish game plan for settling their territory in what's now the United States. And of course, they didn't know it was going to be the United States at all. And some of the missions and presidios that were created are in what is now Mexico. But generally, this was the blueprint that the Spanish used in places like what's now California, Arizona, New Mexico, and Texas. And it's pretty simple. Now, the first aspect of it was the creation of a mission. And the mission, usually these were manned by Franciscan priests. There were actually universities in Mexico that would train Franciscans not only in religion, but in architecture, in defense, in all the many, many things they needed to settle what was an incredibly remote area of North America. So the mission aspect of it was designed to Christianize the various Indian groups in the areas where the Spanish created the missions. And in Texas, it was mostly the Colatecan Indians, the small Indian groups, are indigenous groups in South Texas into northern Mexico. So wherever the Spanish created missions in the Mission Presidio system, the missions were designed to Christianize indigenous groups and to Hispanicize them. In other words, make them Spanish citizens to the extent that the Spanish could. So by Christianizing the different indigenous groups, what the Spanish hoped to do was Hispanicize them, make them Spanish citizens. And thus, this was one of the ways that the Spanish would populate areas like San Antonio and East Texas, but especially San Antonio, Goliad, areas like that. So the missions were designed to Christianize, but also to create population centers as well by creating Spanish citizens, by converting the Indian groups into Christianity, Roman Catholicism, and Hispanicizing them, and especially their children. Okay, so that was the point of the missions. It had both a demographic and a religious aspect to it. Now, the Presidio, and Presidio means defense, it means fort. What the Presidios were, like I said before, they were forts. They were located near the missions, not right next door, because they would be a couple miles down the road. And the reason for that distance is that the area, the land around missions was often used for cattle grazing or for growing crops. So the mission couldn't be right next door to the Presidio. And the Presidio was manned by soldiers. And the responsibility of the Presidio was to protect the mission, was to protect the mission Indians, was to protect the mission priests, and also to protect the small villages that grew up around the missions. And the Presidios also had another aspect as well. What the Spanish hoped is the soldiers that manned the Presidios that were deployed there, many of them there were some Spanish officers who were more upper class, but many of the soldiers, just the common soldiers in the Presidios, were folks that didn't have a lot of opportunity. They were mestizo, and when I say mestizo, they were mixed blood, mixed Spanish blood, Indian blood, and significantly African blood too, because there was slavery into Mexico, and especially in the 15 and 1600s. And so the idea behind the soldiers, when they served in the Presidio, they would protect the surrounding area. But the Spanish hope is that when the Presidio soldiers retired for however long the length of their service was, that they would stay in areas such as San Antonio or Goliad, and then they would settle there, and hopefully they might marry the indigenous groups that had become Hispanicized. So the Presidios also served a dual function: protection of the missions and the surrounding area, but also the Presidios were part of the Spanish plan to create population centers as well. Now, the mission Presidio system did not work very well. I think I said somewhere in one of these podcasts, I think there were ultimately like 27 or so missions in Texas. Today, or the Spanish only succeeded in creating 3 population centers by 1821. One, of course, San Antonio. There were 5 missions here, along with the Presidio. The other one was Nacogdoches, which is now in East Texas. And the third was Goliad, which is down the river near Victoria. And so the Spanish missed more than they hit when it came to the Mission Presidio system. And by the way, there were Mission Presidios in California. There's a beautiful mission that still exists in Santa Barbara to this day. Arizona, New Mexico, as I said before. You don't really see much of the Presidio in San Antonio. If you want to see a Presidio, you need to go to Goliad, where there's a reconstructed mission church. It was rebuilt, I think, in the 1940s or 50s. It's still quite beautiful. But there are some of the original Presidio structure. There's still some of that exists in Goliad to this very day. So just to sum up, the Spanish game plan for populating Texas and other areas of what's now the United States that was owned by Spain was the Mission Presidio system. They worked together in tandem. The Spanish government, there was no separation of church and state. The Spanish government was very much into funding these for its own purposes, along with the Catholic Church, but the money really came from the Spanish government. And there were more misses than hits, but the hits are very significant because here we are in San Antonio in 2023. Goliad still exists. Nacogdoches still exist. So although most of the Mission Presidio complexes failed, the ones that succeeded and took root are still with us to this very day, and very, very much part of that permanent Spanish legacy that I alluded to last week.